We're in the depths of the housing crisis and record numbers of families are homeless.
There's a lot of people calling on the government to sort it, and often the central demand is for more social housing.
We should build social housing. Instead of spending millions a year subsidising private landlords, we could build social housing.
But the government has a mantra in response.
That we risk making the mistakes of the past.
We need to learn of the mistakes of the past, and
repeating the mistakes that were made decades ago.
Where we could get the housing sector restored, but restored in a way that we wouldn't make the mistakes of the past.
So what's happened with social housing, and what are those mistakes of the past that the government keeps referring to? And why don't they just build like they used to? In the 30s, 50s and 60s, the state built a lot more housing than it does now. Those mistakes which the government refers to regularly have their roots in decisions which were made at the end of that period, in the 60s.
A street on the north side of Dublin City.
And in particular, in the reaction to the first big housing crisis of the modern era.
Tragedy strikes at a tenement building in Bolton Street in Dublin. The building collapsed and 2 old people were killed. A week later, another and similar tragedy. 2 girls aged 8 and 9 were buried in the debris.
Now, it's worth understanding what happened in the time right after that. You had the powers that be immediately entering crisis mode. Many of the remaining tenements in Dublin were cleared, leaving hundreds of families in limbo.
I was living with my mother and there was 19 of us in the house, which is only a 2-bedroomed house.
We decided to pitch a tent out here and protest really against no homes.
And at the same time, the economy was on the up. Loads of people were returning from the likes of Liverpool, from London. People like that tended to qualify at the time for social housing.
The population was going up. The government was under fire for a growing housing crisis, so not unlike now. And the response then was basically, let's just build.
During the 60s and 70s, there was social housing going up everywhere.
South Hill in Limerick, Rahoon Flats in Galway, in Mayfield and the Glen in Cork, and in various parts of Dublin, but most prominently Ballymun, which was seen at the time as the jewel in the crown of Ireland's social housing programme.
But here's the thing, some of the big ones, these big schemes, they went wrong quite quickly, Ballymun being chief among them.
The estate was to enjoy from the beginning all the facilities of a small new town, with the town centre as the heart of the community. In fact, no shops were built.
What I'd be concerned about is perhaps the next 5 to 10 years when we have possibly 8,000 to 10,000 teenagers on the estate with nothing to do.
They were rushed up, or the construction quality was terrible, or there were no schools, no shops, or no public transport nearby.
And within a decade or two, some of these areas became heavily associated with drugs or crime or other major social problems.
Problems like poverty and massive local unemployment, which now sees 1 in 3 of the men in these flats on the dole.
Like the young kids now that are starting on gas and glue and Chipex and that stuff. I could give you 20 addicts now that have started like that.
Officials and ministers were kind of burned by all this, and from the mid-80s onwards, the amount of social housing being built was allowed to flatline, and the amount of housing being built by the private sector increased dramatically.
Last year, we had more homes finished here per head than any other country in Europe.
While the government talks about mistakes of the past around social housing, what it means is, it means Ballymun. It means big, sprawling estates and, in the end, lots of social problems. Everything around social housing policy now is designed to avoid that happening again. But what tends not to get mentioned as much is that some of these old schemes from the 60s and 70s worked out just fine.
Critics of the current policies say it's part of West Tala or Dean Rock and Toher and Cork, which should be seen as the examples of how large-scale social housing can work out, not Ballymun.
What do we want? When do we want it?
In their view, recent government efforts to avoid the mistakes of the past have resulted in a situation where we'll never be able to build the amount of social housing society actually needs. The policy has moved on from building big to small plots of social housing dotted through private areas. They say this simply doesn't work at a large scale.
Some critics say the best way to ensure any new big scheme doesn't end up with the social problems which places like Ballymun ended up with is to broaden the qualifications for social housing and to plan, build and better manage the estates. The argument some of them put forward is that young guards, young nurses should qualify for social housing. They say that would give the areas a stability, an ambition, an opportunity which it may otherwise not have in bad economic times or when there's job losses and cuts in services.
But then there's those who say that's just blue sky thinking and that the inevitable questions will arise once there's a crunch. If the state has an empty home and 2 potential occupants, should it offer it to the young guard or the person at risk of homelessness? They say the answer will always be clear and problems inevitably will occur again in big state-owned estates.
Now, in the end, it often comes down to a few central questions on social housing. How much of it should be built? Who should qualify to live in it? And how long should people be allowed to stay?